In November of 1922, a man in his late 40s stood in a dry valley in southern Egypt and prepared to fail for the last time. His name was Howard Carter. He had been digging in this valley, on and off, for 6 seasons, and he had found almost nothing. The man paying for it, an English earl called Lord Carnarvon, had already told him the money was finished. This was the last season. The valley had a reputation by then, and the reputation was that it was empty. It had been dug over for a century. The best-known archaeologist to work it had concluded, in print, that there was nothing left. Carter was clearing the last unexamined patch of ground in it, a triangle of rubble near the entrance, under the tomb of a later pharaoh. He had 6 weeks. On the 4th of November, a workman's tool struck stone that was too flat to be natural. What happened next is the most famous archaeological story in the world, and most of what you have heard about it is simplified or wrong. The famous sentence he said is not quite the sentence he said. The tomb was not untouched. There was no curse, and we can prove that with a survival curve. And the discovery, the part everyone knows, took about 3 weeks. The work took a decade, and it nearly destroyed the thing it was trying to save. The Valley of the Kings is a hot, narrow wadi on the west bank of the Nile. For roughly 500 years, Egypt's pharaohs cut their tombs into its rock, hoping a remote valley would keep the robbers out where pyramids had conspicuously failed. It did not work. Almost every tomb in it was emptied in antiquity, often within a generation of the burial. By the early 1900s, an American businessman named Theodore Davis held the concession. He found a great deal, then concluded in print that the valley was exhausted. In 1914, he gave it up, and Lord Carnarvon bought it. Carnarvon had money and no training. Carter had training and no money. It is a very old arrangement. One correction, because the popular version makes this sound like a lucky hunch. It was not. 2 earlier finds in the valley, a pit of embalming material and a small cache of objects, both carried the name of a minor pharaoh called Tutankhamun. Neither was a tomb. Somebody had buried that king somewhere here, and nobody had found where. Carter was not searching for treasure in general. He was looking for one specific missing king, and he had a reason to think the king was still in the ground. From 1917, he did something unglamorous and enormous. He divided the valley floor into a grid and cleared it, systematically, down to the bedrock, sifting the spoil heaps left by everyone before him. Season after season of nothing. By the middle of 1922, one patch was left, and Carnarvon called him to England to tell him it was over. Here is the detail that usually gets cut. Carter offered to pay for the final season himself. He had almost no money, and he offered anyway. Carnarvon, faced with that, agreed to fund one more. The most famous discovery in archaeology exists because a man refused to be sensible about a triangle of rubble. Digging began on the 1st of November, early in the mornings, to get ahead of the tourists. On the 4th, 3 days in, the workmen found a step cut into the rock beneath the remains of some ancient huts. There is a story about that step. In it, a boy employed to carry water jars scrapes a hole in the sand to stand them upright, and his hands find stone. It is a lovely story, and it may be true. The contemporary record is not clear on whether the step was found during the assigned digging or by a boy working somewhere he had not been sent. And honest accounts say so rather than picking the better version. However it happened, the step became a staircase, cut down into the valley floor. By the next afternoon, there were 12 steps down and facing a plastered doorway stamped with seal impressions. Some of the seals were intact. Whatever lay behind, that door had not been opened since the officials of the royal necropolis closed it. Carter now did something that tells you a great deal about him. He stopped. He had the staircase filled back in. He posted guards on it and sent a telegram to Carnarvon in England saying he had made a wonderful discovery and would await his arrival. Then he waited 3 weeks. Think about what that costs. He was standing on a sealed door at the end of the last season he would ever be funded for. He had every reason to open it that afternoon. Instead, he buried it again and sat in the heat for 20 days. Because the man who had paid for 6 years of failure deserved to be there. Carnarvon arrived on the 23rd of November with his daughter, Lady Evelyn Herbert. They reopened the stairs and cleared the rest of the doorway, and the lower part carried a name: Tutankhamun. Behind the door was a corridor-packed floor to ceiling with rubble. It took a day to clear. At the end of it was a second sealed door. On the afternoon of the 26th of November, Carter made a small hole in the upper left corner of that second door. The first thing he did was not look. He held a candle to the hole. Sealed chambers can hold foul air, and a flame tells you whether the air will kill you before your eyes tell you anything. It guttered, then steadied. Then he widened the hole, put the candle through, and looked. His account describes his eyes adjusting slowly, details emerging out of the dark. Strange animals, statues, and gold. Everywhere the glint of gold. Behind him stood Carnarvon, who could see nothing, and who asked whether Carter could see anything. You know the answer. Yes. Wonderful things. Except that is probably not what he said. That version comes from the book Carter published the following year, written with a co-author. Carter's own notes, made at the time. Record something plainer. Yes, it is wonderful. And Carnarvon, describing the same moment for the Times, remembered Carter saying that there were some marvelous objects there. So we have 3 versions of one sentence. A note made at the time, the account of the other man standing there, and a polished line in a book written months later with a professional writer at his elbow. Nobody lied. A good sentence was made better. It is worth knowing, because almost everything the public knows about this discovery came through that book and a newspaper contract, and not through an excavation report. What was on the other side was a room about 8 meters long, stacked past shoulder height with objects. Dismantled chariots, beds with animal heads, chests, statues, alabaster, and against the far wall, flanked by 2 life-sized guardian figures in black and gold, another sealed doorway. They had not found the burial chamber. They had found the room in front of it. The tomb turned out to be 4 rooms. An antechamber, a side room called the annex, the burial chamber, and a treasury behind it. By the standards of the valley, it is modest, oddly laid out, and much too small for a king. The usual reading is that it was never meant for one, and was pressed into service because a pharaoh died young and something had to be done quickly. Into those 4 small rooms went 5,398 catalogued objects. Now the correction that surprises people most. The tomb was not untouched. It was robbed twice in antiquity, probably within a few years of the burial. Robbers got into the antechamber and the annex and went through the boxes, taking oils, cosmetics, linen and metal. What stopped them was the burial chamber, almost entirely filled by a nest of gilded shrines built around the sarcophagus. They got past the outermost shrine and no further. Then necropolis officials came in behind them, tidied up roughly, resealed the doors and filled the corridor. So it is not an untouched tomb. It is a tomb that was disturbed, closed again by the state, and then lost. And now the part the famous version skips. The discovery took 3 weeks. Clearing the tomb took 10 years. Carter understood immediately that he had a conservation emergency rather than a treasure hunt. Moisture had warped the wood, dissolved ancient glues, and rotted the textiles. Objects that looked solid were held together by habit. He estimated that if they were simply carried out and shipped to Cairo, about 1/10 would survive the journey. So he stopped digging and started recruiting. And here the story stops being about one man. The Metropolitan Museum in New York loaned him a conservator, an architect, an artist, and Harry Burton, regarded as the best archaeological photographer in Egypt. Burton spent years in that tomb making the photographic record that is the reason we can still see what it looked like before it was taken apart. A chemist named Alfred Lucas volunteered and effectively invented his solutions as he went. 3 empty tombs nearby became a laboratory, a darkroom and a canteen. The work in the tomb itself was done by an Egyptian workforce, under 4 Egyptian foremen whose names are in the record and almost never in the retelling. Ahmed Jeriga, Gad Hassan, Hassin Abu Awad. Hassin Ahmed said, "From the 16th of December, every object was numbered, drawn, photographed exactly where it lay, and only then lifted, often after being painted with celluloid solution or hot wax to hold it together long enough to move. The last pieces came out in November of 1930. Conservation ran until February of 1932. The hardest object in the tomb was the king. There were 3 coffins, nested inside one another. The outer two are gilded wood. The innermost is solid gold and weighs about 110 kilograms. Over the face was the mask, gold inlaid with lapis lazuli and colored glass, weighing somewhere around 10 kilograms. The problem was what the priests had poured over the body at the funeral. Ritual unguents had been tipped into the coffins in quantity, and had said, over 3,000 years, they turned into a hard black resin. And that resin had glued the mummy to the base of the innermost coffin and glued the coffins to each other. Worse, the chemistry had carbonized the wrappings and the tissue underneath. The body was not preserved the way an Egyptian mummy normally is. It was fragile, and partly burnt from the inside by its own funeral. They tried the obvious thing first and stood the coffins in the sun to soften the resin. It did nothing. To separate the two inner coffins, they eventually suspended them upside down on trestles, protected the surfaces with wet blankets and sheets of zinc, and ran paraffin lamps underneath until the resin reached about 500 degrees. It worked. It is also, by any modern standard, an appalling thing to have to do. And they knew it. And they could not think of anything better. The mummy could not be lifted out at all. On the 11th of November, 1925, two anatomists, Douglas Derry and Sale Bay Hamdi, began the examination. Over 8 days, they took the body apart, cutting and chiseling it free of the resin piece by piece, because there was no way to remove it whole. Sit with that, because it complicates the usual story. The most careful excavation of its era, run by people who genuinely cared, ended with a king dismembered on a table because the alternative was leaving him welded into a coffin forever. Doing this properly and doing it without damage were not the same thing, and they had to choose. Lord Carnarvon saw almost none of it. In February of 1923, the season ended and the tomb was closed. Around that time, Carnarvon nicked a mosquito bite while shaving. The wound became infected. The infection became blood poisoning, and then pneumonia. He died in Cairo on the 5th of April, about 5 months after the staircase was found. He was 56 and had been in poor health for over 20 years, since the accident that sent him to Egypt in the first place. The newspapers had a spectacular story and no access to it, because Carnarvon had sold exclusive coverage to the Times. Every other paper in the world was locked out of the biggest story of the year. So they printed what they could get, which was speculation. The curse was not found in the tomb. It was already lying around in popular fiction and had been for decades. And it was applied to the death afterwards. A novelist announced she had warned him. A journalist for a rival paper claimed he had watched Carnarvon go down the steps laughing, and said aloud that he gave him 6 weeks to live. Here are the facts. No curse text has ever been found in Tutankhamun's tomb. Not on the seals. Not on the walls. Not on any object. Curse inscriptions do exist in Egypt, but they are mostly in non-royal tombs, and mostly centuries older. And the claim is testable, because we know who was there. In 2002, an epidemiologist named Mark Nelson published a study in the British Medical Journal, doing the obvious thing nobody had bothered to do. He took the 44 Westerners Carter recorded as being in Egypt at the time. He split them into the 25 who were present when a sealed part of the tomb was opened, and the 19 who were not. Then he compared how long they lived. The exposed group died at an average age of 70. The unexposed group died at an average age of 75. Survival after the date of exposure was about 21 years against about 29. Neither difference was statistically significant. Being in the tomb did not shorten anybody's life. There is a simpler version of the same argument. Howard Carter opened the tomb. He was in every room. First, every time. He handled the mask. He spent 10 years inside it. Howard Carter died in 1939, 16 years after Carnarvon. While the conservation went on, a much larger argument was happening above ground, and it had nothing to do with curses. Egypt in 1922 had just been granted a limited independence from Britain, and the question of who owned Egypt's past was a live political one. Then the greatest find in the country's history was made by an English archaeologist, funded by an English earl, who promptly sold exclusive access to a London newspaper. Egyptian journalists were furious and said so. An editorial in Al-Aram accused Carnarvon of exploiting the remains of their ancestors in front of them while telling their grandchildren nothing. There was a hard legal question underneath it. The concession allowed the excavator a share of what he found, unless the tomb was intact, in which case everything belonged to Egypt. Carnarvon's position was that the tomb had been robbed and so was not intact. The Antiquities Service took the view that all of it belonged to Egypt. It came to a head in February of 1924, when the Minister of Public Works refused permission for the excavators' wives to visit and sent police to enforce it. Carter and his colleagues walked out in protest, and Carter locked the tomb, leaving the lid of the sarcophagus hanging in midair on ropes above the coffin. The government cancelled his concession, sawed off his locks, and secured the lid themselves. Carter sued. His lawyer told the court the government had seized the tomb like a bandit, and there were riots in Cairo. Carter won the first case and lost the appeal. It took most of a year and a change of government before he was allowed back. In January of 1925. The terms were straightforward. Carter could finish. Lady Carnarvon would pay for it and give up every claim to a single object. The newspaper monopoly was over. Egypt kept all of it. Something like a sixth of the Egyptian museum's permanent display came out of that one small tomb. Carter's own conduct does not survive this part cleanly. He gave small objects from the tomb away as gifts. After his death, his niece found some among his possessions and returned them, and the Metropolitan Museum returned several more to Egypt in 2010. And the scholarly publication was never written at all. Carter produced 3 popular volumes. The real excavation report was still unwritten when he died. The best recorded excavation of its age never got its book, which leaves the boy in the middle of it. He was born Tutankhamun, the living image of the Aten. The sun disk his father had made the only god of Egypt. That father was almost certainly Akhenaten, the pharaoh who tried to replace the traditional religion with the worship of one god, closed the old temples and moved the capital into the desert. He became pharaoh at about 8 or 9 years old. Around his 3rd year on the throne, the experiment was reversed. The old gods came back, Amen above all. The temples reopened. The court left the desert city, and the boy changed his name from Tutankhamun to Tutankhamun, from the image of one god to the image of another, which tells you everything about who was making the decisions. He reigned about 9 years and died at around 18. For decades, the popular theory was murder, because an X-ray taken in 1968 showed loose bone inside the skull. In 2005, a computed tomography scan settled it. There is no evidence of a blow to the head. The loose bone was almost certainly dislodged after death, during embalming or during the examination in 1925. He was not murdered. What the scans suggest, instead, is a young man in poor health. There is evidence of malaria and a badly broken leg with no sign of healing, which means it happened close to the end. The consensus leans towards an infected fracture in a body already fighting malaria. This is not closed. A genetic study published in 2010 concluded that his parents were full brother and sister, which would explain a great deal. Other specialists have questioned how far you can push DNA recovered from mummified remains. He was not a great king. He reigned for 9 years as a child, under advisors, and undid his father's revolution on their instructions. When he died, the men who followed him removed his name from the monuments and from the king lists. He was erased on purpose. And that erasure is the only reason we have him. Because a forgotten king is a king nobody robs a second time. Because a name struck off the record is a tomb nobody remembers the location of. Because 2 centuries later, when workmen came to cut a tomb for a much more important pharaoh, they built their huts over a doorway they had no idea was there, and threw their rubbish on top of it, and sealed the whole thing under a hillside of debris for 3,000 years. Every other king in that valley was famous. Every other king in that valley was emptied. The one we can still see is the one nobody thought was worth remembering.